Hi there, welcome to this SharePoint Server 2013 Core Solutions training series. The name of this nugget is Installing SharePoint Theory. This nugget is all about answering the question, how do we install SharePoint Server 2013? So we're going to get right into the gears here, grinding the gears, understanding, installation prerequisites, not intellation prerequisites, performing the installation. What happens when? We have the two phases where we lay the binaries down and then we run the config wizard. What's actually happening during that wizard, you'll know by the end of this nugget. Farm configuration. Again, we have a choice here. We can use a wizard or we can go manually. When would you choose one above the other? For that matter, we have a few different ways of installing SharePoint Server 2013. How and why would we go one way or the other? Now, what if you're tasked not with installing SharePoint on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 servers, but on 25? There we're going to get into scripting the installation. Actually, scripting an installation is useful even if you are doing just 3, 4, 5 installations because we can avoid human error and ensure consistency. We're going to learn how to script and automate all aspects of the installation, the prerequisites, the binary load, as well as the farm configuration. We'll look at installation tracking and blocking, how we can audit SharePoint installation, and then we'll finish with deploying language packs, useful for multinational organizations who need to support alternate languages. Let's get started. Preparing to install SharePoint Server 2013. What do we need to know? Well, we need to have quite a bit of access in Active Directory, number one. As an installer, we need to install with proper privileges. We need to be a domain admin, really, a member of the local administrators group of that SharePoint server, but certainly a domain admin for a domain installation. Now, what's neat about SharePoint is that it will take care of assigning permissions to your service accounts. You will need to create a number of service accounts. Remember that a service account is an Active Directory user account. It could be a local account, but we're going to assume AD here. That is not an administrator. Remember the principle of least privilege. I know some administrators who tend to use domain admin for everything, including service accounts. That's not a good idea because if someone or something were to compromise the service, then that service can wield a sword equivalent to the Active Directory credential behind it, you see? So service accounts are not for human consumption. They're for service use, and you don't have to give them permissions. In IIS, in SQL Server, in Windows, and Active Directory, SharePoint will actually take care of the permissions and will actually take care of password changes. Managed Service Accounts, or MSAs, introduced in Windows Server 2008 R2, if my memory serves, enable us to deploy service accounts and not have that annoying situation occur that when Active Directory password policy kicks in, we lose our service accounts because they can't change their own passwords. MSAs can change their own passwords, and when we link MSAs with SharePoint Server 2013, you've got yourself just an automated situation. Now, I also mentioned the setup user. This is the Active Directory user credential that is logged on to the SharePoint server when you install. And as I said, that account needs to be an administrator, and you also do need to create a login for SQL Server manually for this guy. And specifically, that SQL Server login has to be a security admin. That's a fixed server role in SQL Server. And also DB Creator, that's another fixed server role. And hopefully that makes sense because the setup user is going to indirectly be creating logins and creating databases in your SQL Server instance. The setup user also is going to need to be the database owner for all SharePoint databases. Now, if the setup user is a member of the domain admins group, and if you've made administrators a global administrator in SQL Server, then you're good to go. But if not, especially if you have separation of powers between the systems admins and ops and your SQL Server DBAs, you may need to have a discussion with them and let them know so they can modify your permissions in SQL Server. Another account that is a quasi-service account is called the server farm account, also called a content access account. You do not want to use your administrative credential for this. This is, again, a separate account that's created for SharePoint. SharePoint will give the account the appropriate permissions in Active Directory as well as in SQL Server. And this is the go-between in terms of the SharePoint binaries and SQL Server. Other service accounts that you may or may not already have created, application pool accounts, you specify those and SharePoint assigns them, and best practice is to use MSAs wherever possible. I think I've over-explained this a little bit. For the most part, your take-home message is to make sure that the person installing SharePoint is an administrator and that he or she has appropriate access to SQL Server, and that you've created enough service accounts for SharePoint to use for the server farm account and for its application pool accounts. The first phase of SharePoint installation, and this should come as no surprise if you've installed previous versions of SharePoint, is to install a number of prerequisites. We have to bring a couple server roles up on the SharePoint box, and we have to download a whole bunch of individual prerequisites. We'll look at what all of those individual components are in the demo. For now, just know that we have a decision to make. We can either load the prerequisites online directly by downloading from the Microsoft download site, or you can pull down the prerequisites individually and deploy them from a network share. Your decision here is, am I installing just once or many times? And if I'm installing SharePoint on multiple servers, do I really want to make a separate download each time I pull down those prerequisites? In the SharePoint installation media, there's an executable called prerequisiteinstaller.exe. And if you run the SharePoint setup wizard, setup.exe, it'll invoke prerequisite installer with a GUI front end. You just click next, 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 finish. And if the SharePoint server is connected to the internet, those prerequisites just come down, the server roles get automatically and transparently loaded, you reboot, and you're good to go. If you're going to script out prerequisites, what you can do is create a CMD file, a batch file, a shell script file. Potentially you could call this from your PowerShell as well, of course. And you call prerequisite installer with a number of traditional old school MS-DOS switches. /, then you've got a name, a shorty name of each prerequisite, colon, and then you provide the path to the Microsoft installer file. Now this presumes that you've downloaded all of those prerequisites. I'll put up a pop-up balloon where you can go. It's a well-known website where you can download everything. You also can check the syntax by running prerequisite installer /?. Now, doing this from a single interactive command prompt is horrible because if you make a spelling error, you've got to do it over again. It's much easier to use an arguments file to make sure you don't mistype something. If you put this syntax into a text file, now you can't have any carriage returns. It has to be a single line. And if you name the file prerequisiteinstaller.arguments.txt, place it in the same directory as your prerequisiteinstaller.exe, you can just run the prerequisite installer graphical tool and it will use whatever paths you put in your arguments file. And those could be universal naming convention paths or local paths depending upon your needs. Of course, you're going to get the best flexibility in your network if you download and put your prerequisites in a shared folder. Actually, you would unpack the SharePoint DVD into that share location, and you'd also add your prerequisites to that location as well. Best practice, use quotes in your paths even if there are no spaces. So it would be SQL NCLI : quote whack whack server 1 blah 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 MSI quote space, and then you do your next one. Okay? So that in a nutshell is how you can automate prerequisites. Now note that this is not automating your server role. You're going to have to use, if you want to, the install Windows feature PowerShell commandlet to add those server roles. And again, I'll put up a pop-up balloon where you can go to a page to learn how to do that. And I'm going to cover all this in the next couple demos. There's so much to installing that I'm actually going to give you 2 demo nuggets on this. Now, when I was introducing this nugget, I mentioned tracking and blocking SharePoint installations. And some of you, I'm sure more experienced SharePoint administrators, your ears perked up and you thought, I'd like to know more about that. There's good news and bad news with this. The good news is that we do have some ability to audit SharePoint installations and block rogue installations of SharePoint. The bad news is that it's, in my humble opinion, a bit half-baked. Now, first of all, we know that rogue servers of any kind cause all sorts of problems. This could be from simple mischief to actual, honest-to-goodness security breaches. Think of someone who's a hotshot and they bring up a DHCP server. They're just testing, right? Quote unquote. But then when users can't connect in your network because they've received a bogus IP address from the DHCP server that's not authorized in your network, you see the idea. You may have a lot of developers in your organization, so you may feasibly have folks who try to bring up their own SharePoint farms. You can track installations of server farms within your Active Directory domains. By using ADSI Edit, you create a container for the service connection point. SharePoint creates a service connection point for each farm in your domain, and this makes it easier for services to be advertised and users and processes to connect to those services in your environment. This again is per domain tracking. Any new farms that come up in your domain will be tracked, and you'll be able to see that occur. Now, of course, any user is not going to be able to bring up a new farm in a domain, but if you have many administrators in your domain, you can easily see and figure out how many farms you have at any time. That's what I mean, that this isn't particularly elegant. It's a little half-baked, but it's better than nothing. As far as blocking SharePoint, I could think of quicker ways like maybe App Blocker, but you can set a registry key either on a machine-by-machine basis or using group policy, and set a specific key called disable install on each box. And if you do that, that effectively blacklists that machine, and if an administrator tries to install SharePoint, they'll see an error message box. Now, in previous versions of SharePoint, the actual installation options were mega confusing, and if you went down the wrong rabbit hole, you could just be hamstrung and determine, well, I've got to scratch this whole installation and start over again. Very annoying. The same basic types are still available, but the UI is a little bit more legible now in SharePoint Server 2013. If you're in a testing development environment, or maybe you want to mock up a small farm to show to your boss to try to convince them to adopt SharePoint, the path of least resistance is the single server with SQL Server Express. This is what used to be called the standalone installation, where you have a farm in a box, basically. This could be a virtual machine or a physical machine, but you can't expand. You're limited to the SQL Server Express 10 gigabyte limit. You have to be in a domain, interestingly, to do this, but you can't install this, you cannot, that is, on a domain controller. And also, somewhat interestingly, this option gives you SQL Server 2008 R2 SP1 Express, not SQL 2012. So, like I said, that is not an option you want for a production environment, really, in just about any case, unless you're completely cache-strapped or you're a very small shop. You want to avoid this. This is the way to do demos and testing, and for the smallest, most cache-constrained organizations. The main way to go is to build out a true N-tier farm where you have a full installation of SQL Server. And if you're installing and a full installation of SQL is detected on the network, this is the path that the installer will, quote, instinctively follow. This allows you to expand, of course. The SQL Server can be either on that box or on a separate box. If you install on the same box, you're going to get some farm messages where SharePoint says, look, this is not the best situation. Of course, the best situation is to separate your roles into web front end, app servers, and SQL servers. As I've said, the installation overview consists of phases. We have our prerequisite phase that does involve a reboot, unfortunately. Then we run setup.exe to lay down the binaries to create the hive, the 15 hive as it's called, that has your master pages. Under the hood, you're getting your services instantiated. Third step, you can't leave that out. You have to run the configuration wizard. This builds the farm proper. You apply a passphrase for farm security. This connects to SQL Server and actually creates the content databases used for central administration, as well as your initial site collection. There's post-installation steps as well, of course, that we'll get to in the demo. Now, after you do those steps, the first time you log into Central Administration is the web-based administrative portal for SharePoint. The Central Administration web app is the same thing as your public portal. That is to say, by public, I'm assuming intranet, the SharePoint portal you're using in your organization. I'm over-explaining again. Anyway, what I'm saying is that there's nothing special about Central Administration. It's just another SharePoint site. The difference, of course, is access. you have to be a farm administrator to log into central administration. And when you do that for the first time, you'll get a little pop-up window that asks you, do you want to configure your farm using a wizard, or do you want to do it manually? The upshot or upside, I should say, to using the wizard is that it's click, click, next. It's fast and easy. The big downside is you have little no control over what happens. You're going to wind up dollars to donuts with more service apps than you need. Those service apps spawn databases. Those service apps spawn app pools and IIS. That means you're committing disk space, CPU usage, memory. You're expanding the vulnerability footprint of your solution. You definitely want to do the wizard only when you're time constrained and you just need a quick and dirty site, or should I say farm, to show somebody something, really, or for your development. The manual way is tougher, of course, because you start with no service applications and you have to deploy them yourself. And sometimes there's dependencies that you'll need to resolve. The upshot, though, of course, is that you're subscribing to least service, which reduces or minimizes the attack surface of your farm and your SharePoint servers. And you're also, of course, improving the efficiency and the performance of the system because it's got CPU cycles and RAM and disk and network bandwidth to spare that it otherwise wouldn't just be uselessly cycling, you see? Another great advantage of manual farm configuration is that you can take control over service application database names. As you know, in SQL Server Management Studio, you'll see that SharePoint uses these GUIDs, which itself, I'm sure it has no problem parsing those and figuring out which database goes with which web application, service application, etc. But we human administrators aren't accustomed to seeing these long honking GUIDs. It's much better, I think, to have control over the name and to name them in a way that makes immediate sense to us and to our colleagues. Remember what I said in the previous few nuggets when we were dealing with soft skills? When you're designing this stuff, you want to design it in such a way that after you're gone and you're out of the scene, those who are responsible for managing the SharePoint solution can continue to do so efficiently. All right, so I showed you how to automate the prerequisite installer process by downloading those prerequisites, creating an arguments file, using PowerShell to install the necessary server roles, potentially staying with PowerShell and simply calling the prerequisite installer.exe file and then have it pick up the arguments file. Cool and cool. Now, how about scripting or automating the other phases of SharePoint, including the main installation? As it happens, the SharePoint distribution, which is to say the SharePoint DVD or download, includes several extensible markup language or XML files. They're called config.xml. That's incidentally the same name that Microsoft uses for their Microsoft Office automation. And in these XML files, we can specify the parameters of a SharePoint installation. Most importantly, we can use the product ID or put in the product ID. Now that's sensitive, of course. It's not encrypted. So you want to be careful of those config XML files. If they fall into the wrong hands, you've got potential for piracy, don't you? We can also add the installation type. In effect, config.xml is what's called an answer file. And an answer file simply answers, right, the questions that the installer typically requires you to do manual intervention on. Invoking the config XML is really easy. You simply add it as a switch to setup.exe. It's /config : and then the path to the config.xml. And that's all there is to it. So we can feasibly link with PowerShell the server role prerequisites, the binary prerequisites, and then the actual installation, all in one .ps1 script file. Now you'll recall that in Windows Server, scripts are blocked from running by default, so you'll need to at least temporarily adjust the execution policy of your SharePoint server such that the script will in fact run. You can actually automate or script the farm configuration as well. For the first server in a farm, we have a commandlet called new SharePoint farm. When you're adding additional servers to the farm, you use connect SP configuration database. Awesome advantages of these PowerShell commandlets is that we can avoid human error by making sure our syntax is correct. And we also have full control over everything. Credentials, database names, service application instance names, you got it. You've got control over it. Now, just parenthetically, from you to me to you, whatever, as your friend, as your instructor, that 70-331 test doesn't focus much on PowerShell. Instead, you'll see more of an emphasis on the GUI, and I just find that, this is an emoticon, by the way, I find that so head-scratching and so antithetical to Microsoft's own stated goals. That is to say, if you've taken other Microsoft Cert exams over the last handful of years, you've had to know the PowerShell that accompanies most tasks in that technology. Why do we see more of an emphasis on the GUI than PowerShell for this certification exam? It is what it is, though, and I just leave that information with you for you to ponder. As you know, Microsoft makes adjustments to their enterprise software. The two main methods for updating server software are the cumulative update and the service pack. Cumulative updates are on a release schedule, so we can plan for these as a systems administrator. Service packs occur less frequently, and service pack consists of a roll-up of any cumulative updates since the last service pack or release to manufacturing RTM version of that software. Also, service packs tend to give you enhanced or new functionality. I think Microsoft does that as an incentive to get folks to adopt that service pack. But anyway, as it happens, we can slipstream that stuff into our SharePoint installation. I mean, let's look at it 6 months from now and we've got, say, 2 cumulative updates out. It's going to save us some time if we're deploying a new SharePoint server to automate the installation and include those updates in the installation as opposed to having to run Windows Update, pull down from WSUS, whatever we've got going on there. Assuming we've tested the cumulative updates and they work, they don't break anything, why not slipstream them? Here's what you need to know for your test, and this is the Cliff Notes version of how this works. You download your update exes, whether it's a CU or a service pack, it doesn't matter. And you extract those files into the updates subfolder of your media. So let's say you've got your SharePoint RTM media. You've extracted all the DVD contents into a folder. And let's say you've shared out that folder and we've called it SP Installer. In SP Installer, or whatever you name that folder, there is a subfolder called Updates. That's where you want to extract your cumulative update and service packs, not the exes. You actually need to pull the manifest files and the individual MSIs and MSUs from those archives. So you would give the name of the cumulative update or service pack. This is just a placeholder. /extract : and then the path to the update subdirectory. That's pretty old school syntax. You've probably been there, done that, bought the t-shirt many, many times. What's cool about that is after you've done your extraction and you go to install SharePoint, when you call setup.exe, you don't have to specify anything with updates. The setup will automatically go into the updates folder and grab and install those binaries. Isn't that great? Once the installation completes, you can verify by going into your central administration web application under Upgrade and Migration and check the program and patch installation status for that server. Final whiteboard of this nugget, installing language packs. This is a special case scenario. Let's say you're in a multinational organization and you need a multilingual SharePoint deployment. First, you need to have the underlying Windows language files installed first. Now, as it happens, nowadays, Windows gives the most common world languages in Windows right off the bat, and you can go into the control panel to change the underlying language in Windows there. Otherwise, you'll need to download the Windows languages separately. And generally speaking, there's no prejudice here. It's just some languages like Thai, let's say, and right to left languages like Arabic, there's a lot of overhead with keeping those on a system. So that's why those are separate. Mandarin, let's say. You get those installed on your SharePoint server, that's fine. Next, you download and install the appropriate language pack for SharePoint. But they all have the same name, unfortunately, so if you're doing true multilingual, you might want to change the executable name so you don't overwrite anything. You install the language pack just like you'd install any program on your SharePoint server, and then you run the SharePoint configuration wizard on each box, and what that'll do is add appropriate template files, UI elements that are localized for that language. Here's the gotcha. If you go into Control Panel, Programs and Features and remove the language pack, then any sites that are deployed using that language pack are hosed. They immediately become inaccessible. So essentially, this is like extending the schema. You can extend it, but you really can't contract it without doing damage. Now let's review what we've learned installing SharePoint Server. There's quite a bit in this nugget for sure. You now understand the phases of installation. First of all, there's installation prerequisites. We know how to do this just clicky. We also know how to script the prerequisite installation. We understand the installation options and methods by which we can lay down the binaries and services. We understand farm configuration from the perspective of the configuration wizard, what that does, as well as farm configuration, initial setup in central administration, why you would want to go manual versus wizard. A lot on scripting, and that's really important. Like I said, just to repeat, scripting is not only cool because it's faster, but even better, you're ensuring uniformity. I've dealt with shops that needed to document every change they've made in the organization, including something like installing a server. How are you going to document that? Well, one nice way to document exactly what you've done in deploying a SharePoint server is to archive the script file. There it is. You can see what I've done to create said server. We discussed some new features in SharePoint and how we can track and block rogue installations of SharePoint, and we covered deploying language packs. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.